So first we're going to talk about an exchange which became popular sometime in the last like 100 years, just to overshoot. Whom66 makes an interesting observation. They said never trade pieces. I felt this way at one point when I was a beginner, and since I'm pretty much still a beginner in some sense, I still feel like I don't like to exchange my pieces. The reason for that is, at least the way I've diagnosed it for myself, is I prefer to play attacking chess, and usually with more pieces on the board, there's more promise of an attack at some point. So that's why I don't like to exchange pieces. But sometimes exchanging is the best thing to do. But first we're going to see that in this position, exchanging is optional. And it frequently is. That's part of what makes this such a nebulous topic and something that you don't really get a lot of puzzles for. If you had a puzzle for exchanges, probably it would come with a prompt that would ask you, should we exchange or not? So for you guys who are already here in the chat, what would you guys do? It's white to play, and the only exchange on the board is bishop takes c6. Would you do it? If so, why or why not? We could never trade pieces. That's possible. So Whom66 wants to provoke a6. I think that's pretty reasonable, because maybe you want them to have some more pawn weaknesses, or maybe you want to keep the tension as long as possible with hopes of some tactical stuff. So that's quite reasonable. But then I guess we'll have to look at a couple options here. If we're not going to play bishop takes c6, what will we actually do? Chess Engine user, welcome. Your criticism of the move c5 is appreciated. You should really just play the Spanish, right? Chess Engine user, would you capture on c6 right now or do something different? If so, what move would you play? We'll look at a couple options. Okay, castling. Makes sense. I'm guessing Whom66 would do something similar, so let's talk about castling. Okay, d4, that's interesting too. Or c3. So we have the candidate moves d4, castling, and c3 on top of our suggested bishop takes c6. So I guess we'll talk about what happens if we don't exchange first. If we castle, probably the biggest challenge will be to eventually play a6. So after maybe rook e1, a6, how are we going to deal with the bishop on b5 if we don't want to trade it? What would you guys do with the bishop now? Not bishop a4? Yeah, good point. If we play bishop a4, we will see the error of our ways on the board. It is a trap. But bishop f1 is a palatable move. Even though we are retreating the bishop as far as possible along the diagonal, it doesn't really matter because the bishop is exerting a good influence on all the squares that it left behind. Plus, it's out of the way of the other pieces, so kind of long term, we're not going to see any struggle between this bishop and its own side's pieces. So that's pretty good. We could also take on c6 at this point. Yeah, we have a lot of options here. Which is actually part of my point in showing this example, that we could exchange, or we could not exchange in some positions. Sometimes you're just not forced to. But my secondary point is not just that, oh, we could trade or we could not trade. It's that the positions that we get after we trade or refuse to trade can be remarkably different from each other, even though they're just a few moves apart in the variation tree. So I guess we could look at a couple other options first. If we play c3 right now, after a6, probably bishop a4 is the move. And after b5, we're going to have to retreat to c2. So this is yet another way that we can avoid the exchange. And this position is also quite markedly different from the variation with the bishop on f1. I once played a game where my opponent played c4, and I did d4, en passant, queen d3, and I got a pretty nice position. All right, so some people like bishop c6, so we'll show that, and then we can compare all of these. So after, let's say they play bishop c6 right away. After any capture with a pawn, we're probably going to play a move like d3, And this position has some pros and cons. If you guys use the evaluation technique like what I published in my other video, you'll notice that here black is the bishop pair, but they also have doubled pawns. And white maybe has like a slight edge in development in space. There's also pawn d4 in this position. Although I'm not really sure about this one, because after pawn takes, you can't play knight takes. I'm sorry, you can't play queen takes. If you play knight takes, then bishop g7, we're probably going to have to trade some pieces anyway. It looks a little like, I'm not sure what your thesis is here, but maybe this is also an opening line, I'm just not aware of it. So let's compare a couple of these. So if we take right away, we get a better pawn structure, but we lose the bishop pair. If we castle, we can retreat the bishop all the way to f1, where we control the queen side pretty well, but at a loss of time. And if we play c3, we can retreat a la the Spanish opening to c2, where we control the king side reasonably well. So there's a variety of different positions. Alright, so Chess Engine user is suggesting after a6 you could take and then play d4, and saying maybe white is much better. But in this position, after d takes d4, I don't see why you should be much better, but you definitely do have a space advantage. But I think you'll be missing the bishop pair. Like, what move would you play here for white? I didn't prepare this ahead of time, just for the record. I just talking out of my hat here. Okay. Now I'm considering either bishop g4 or knight f6. They both look quite reasonable. I think I'll suggest bishop g4. Do you have something here? I see a way to get a very playable, edgy endgame if I played c5. I guess you could respond with d5. I don't know if I would venture so far to say that white is much better, but it does look interesting to play. But when you are deciding whether you would like to exchange or not, it's actually a very committal moment. For example, right here, if we don't take on c6 right now, we might be forced into various avenues. We might be forced to put our bishop on c2, or we might be forced to put our bishop on f1, or even on d3. We might, if we don't want to take on c6, we might have to accept a really different kind of position. So almost any time exchanges are available, I would say that this is a critical moment.